Hello and welcome to FO Live for our US election special. FO Live is brought to you by Fair Observer, a platform for citizen journalism with over 2,500 contributors from 90 different countries. And we would love you to join the conversation. So please do listen to our talk, sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our channel, follow us on social media, and of course you can publish with us too. As we know, it's been a turbulent year with the COVID-19 pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests, and now Donald Trump and Joe Biden fighting it out to be the next US president. And during these chaotic and slightly complicated and confusing times, it's always good to get some guidance from people who know a little bit more than we do. So I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for tonight, our panelists. We're joined tonight by Gary Grappo, who's a former US ambassador and Middle East expert. Shemeka Michelle is an author and personal empowerment advocate, and she's also joining us hot off the campaign trail. We also have Jacqueline Francis, who's a pediatrician based in Washington, DC, and Atul Singh, who's the CEO, founder, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. So welcome to you all.
Thank you.
So I think we'll start off with Gary Grappo. If we can just ask you to try and put this in a slightly global perspective. We're asking really what the US elections mean, not just for America, but for the rest of the world. So what would a Trump re-election or what would a Biden election mean in terms of the post-World War order? How would it affect the world, if that's not too big a question?
Well, it is a very big question, certainly for people around the world, but most especially for the United States. First of all, let me just say it's a pleasure to join the other panelists, Shemeka, Jackie, and Atul, in talking about this really quite historic election for Americans and for many, many people around the world. In terms of the potential impact of a second Trump administration or a Biden administration, I'd like to reflect back on the history of the international scene, so to speak, since the end of World War II, when the United States was the lone and unchallenged superpower throughout the world. And it set about to really knit together nations from around the world in a network of alliances, partnerships, agreements, and understandings. The primary focus of that effort was to avoid the two catastrophes that the world had confronted in the first half of the 20th century, namely World War I and World War II. Now, I want to underscore that we were not necessarily motivated in any altruistic form, although there was certainly that component present. But this was an effort at enlightened self-interests. The United States had been dragged into two world wars, and it sought to ensure that such an occurrence never happened again. And the way that it wanted to do this was to bringing all nations together to work together for common security and prosperity development. This has been largely successful. We saw the US either take the lead or support efforts in forming international organizations throughout the world, everything from the United Nations to the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, World Health Organizations, and literally dozens of international as well as regional organizations, which had helped bring together countries in advancing common interests. Now, when the United States tried to do this, we really didn't exclude any countries at the very beginning. Some opted out, particularly the Soviet Union to start with, but nevertheless, we wanted to bring together countries that shared, at the very least, common interests, but also common values. Every single US president since 1945 has endorsed that approach, whether Republican or Democrat. Donald Trump, in his almost last 4 years, has sought to undermine that. He's spoken out very, very critically against multilateralism and working with allies. He's actually criticized some of the United States' most critical, most important, and longest allies, European countries, even Canada and Mexico, Japan, South Korea, and other countries of Asia, and even Latin America, lashing out against Mexico. Joe Biden probably, if elected, will probably, his first priority in foreign policy is to reaffirm the U.S. commitment to our alliances and our friends and partners around the world. I want to underscore that there's been a lot of debate about this notion of an international order, which is ultimately what resulted from this American effort joined by many, many countries around the world. We could not have done it alone, to bring countries together to advance common interests. This international order has, up until now, been led by the United States. And in an election in which Donald Trump moves into a second term, this will be severely undermined, if not ended. And my concern is that the alternative to this US-led international order will be less international order and a greater probability of conflict around the world, and a great power conflict in which many medium and small sized countries will probably suffer the most, but the interest of all countries will suffer without a US in charge of or at least leading this effort in conjunction with friends and allies around the world.
Okay, Gary, thank you so much for that answer. Shemeka, if I can come to you, I know that you're a Trump supporter, and Gary did mention some things there that you probably disagree with. So can I ask you why you support Trump, and what your take is really on his role, not just in the US, but abroad as well, and how he's potentially ripping up that international order, as Gary mentioned?
You know, I'm a firm believer that if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And what I appreciate about President Trump is that he's doing things differently than what has been done for years. You know, Gary did mention that there have been certain things done, you know, for decades. And I just appreciate that President Trump appears to put America first and does things which seem to benefit Americans. So as an American, that's my concern, that he's doing things that, you know, it would be like me trying to feed people outside of my house before feeding someone inside of my house. I am going to be concerned with those in my home before I ever try to step outside and take care of those outside of my home. And that's what I appreciate about President Trump, that he is focused on America first and doing what benefits Americans before trying to do what benefits the others in the world.
Okay, great, thank you. Perhaps Jacqueline, if I can come to you, you work as a pediatrician in Washington, DC, I understand. And is he putting Americans first? What do you see when you're working in healthcare? Do you see that Trump is helping Americans?
I was very surprised by his approach in general, because it didn't seem to me that he was putting American first for a number of reasons. One, well, I guess with a number of examples. One would have been, he didn't move forward with pushing companies to unify towards creating ventilators until quite late in the process. I mean, the obvious thing, I guess, that we all know is that he actually went out of his way to not be honest about the severity of the condition of this virus on the front end, in order to, as he put it, to alleviate fear and make people more calm. But calmness doesn't necessarily keep people from dying. And particularly with the pandemic, from the public health perspective, honest communication about the infection, honest communication about how to prevent the spread of the infection are critical in the early parts of the spread of an infection for a pandemic. So the fact that he concealed that information and seemed to, from the beginning, even imply that it was a hoax, like he never really seemed to really take it very seriously. That in itself was a significant issue with regard to jeopardizing lives in the United States. Many lives could have been saved. There are many studies that have actually reported that, in fact, had he changed his approach with managing the public health message, we could have had fewer fatalities. And by far in this world, we exceed everyone else. And it is likely because of poor communication on the front end, for honest communication related to this pandemic and what it really means.
And Jacqueline, just to follow up on that, does the fact that he obviously caught COVID-19 himself. Does that change anything, do you think? Do you think Trump's taking it more seriously now?
Doesn't seem to be the case. He seems to be talking, I believe I heard today that he's talking about kissing people. So no, he seems to be further downplaying the pandemic and speaking to it's something that, while I may agree with him, I don't believe it's something that people should be afraid of. It is a cold virus, just like any other cold virus, in that it is contagious. And most people do get many cold viruses throughout a cold season. But this one is definitely not the same. And this one causes significant morbidity and mortality, and it must be taken seriously. And he does not seem to be taking it seriously, despite the fact that he caught the infection himself. And it's almost a bit frustrating that he, in addition to that, was taken by helicopter to medical experts who could give him the care that most Americans in this country cannot get. And he recovered and he's fine, but his approach is, oh, sure, don't worry about it. It's not that big a deal. And let me go out now and do campaigns in areas like retirement homes or places where there will be people, again, potentially out without masks, and he will be there without masks, and he's dancing and joking about kissing people. I can't quite see where he's taking this seriously at any point in the last 10 months, but I find it fascinating that to be a leader of this country with all the resources and all the information available to you, that 10 months into a pandemic, you get COVID. It's not as if he got this infection very early in the pandemic when we didn't have a lot of information. And I'd be surprised at this point to see any other leader of any other country contracting coronavirus 10 months into a pandemic.
Okay. Atul, if we can come to you, obviously COVID is dominating all our thoughts, but there's also the economy to think of. And I just wonder, if we're looking at Trump and Biden, how do they differ in their visions of the economy, both in the US and I guess looking at the global recession as well? Could you just explain those differences and how they play out if Trump won or if Biden won?
Well, there are three fundamental differences. One, of course, which Gary has alluded to, deals with the approach to trade. Since World War II, the US has led a free trade order, and it created institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and obviously later the WTO, which looked specifically at trade. And so that free trade order is out of the window. It has been out of the window since 2016. So if Biden wins, expect the Americans going back to their post-war contract, global contract. If Trump wins, then it is protectionism all the way. It is a reversion, actually, to the first act of Congress, which was tariffs, so that America could industrialize. And at that time, America was keeping out British goods. And so, number one, that is the difference, protectionism. Number two, regulation. Democrats historically have a view that regulation is important, and regulation contains some of the excesses of the free market. Republicans think that red tape asphyxiates business. Now, there's an element of truth to both arguments, and what Trump has been doing, in the words of Steve Bannon, his now indicted, if I don't know if he's indicted, but certainly charged former advisor, is the deconstruction of the administrative state. So regulation under Trump has gone down, will go down further. The third thing where there would be differences, and this is my judgment, and it could be wrong, is when it comes to dealing with tech oligopolies. Donald Trump and his administration takes the view that Silicon Valley is democratic and is opposed to his party, even though paradoxically Trump owes his success in a large measure to Twitter and perhaps even Facebook. But come a second term, one could expect stronger executive action against Amazon, Facebook, and even Google. I think Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will go lighter. If nothing else, Kamala Harris is from California, and some of her backers, her strongest backers, are from Silicon Valley. So, whilst I suspect Trump gains his funding from other sources. So Trump is more likely to go after the tech oligopolies. And this, of course, will have massive implications for the world. Imagine if Facebook is broken up and WhatsApp and Instagram become independent companies, then everybody from India to Kenya to Argentina will find that things might change a wee bit. So that's my understanding and analysis.
Okay, thank you, Atul. So that's perhaps the sort of global economic impact. Shemeka, if I can come back to you, how important is the economy in this election? Is this something that people are really focused on this year? Shemeka?
Sorry about that. I do think it's very important to people. If we look at the economy prior to COVID-19, we were doing very well. Especially with Black people having the lowest unemployment ever. And of course, I believe that President Trump is the person to actually get us back to that good economy. And when it comes to race relations in general, which is, you know, what you told me you wanted me to talk about, when it comes to voting for President Trump, it's my opinion that as the Republican candidate, President Trump creates or brings us closer to the equality for Black people that we've always been looking for. It is my opinion that since its inception, the Republican Party has always fought for the equality of Black people and opposed to treating us like second-class citizens as if we can't have the same achievements or achieve what white Americans or others can. When we look at the economy and the way that the things that President Trump did prior to COVID and the plan that he has for the next 4 years when it comes to the Platinum Plan for Black Americans, it's my opinion that it opens opportunity to create a level playing field for us, whereas, you know, the Democrats, in my opinion, push the same victimhood mentality from, you know, saying that voter ID is voter suppression for Black people as if we're still in chains and can't, you know, get ID, to having white people smashing cars and buildings saying, you know, as if their voices are superior to ours and that we need their validation for our existence. So I think that President Trump, opposed to Biden, would be the best person when it comes to creating a level playing field for Black people to actually achieve economically.
Okay, Shemeka, that's really interesting. What's your take on the Black Lives Matter movement? Are you against it, or you think it has some merits?
Well, I definitely think it has a great sentiment. Black lives do matter, as do all lives, but I don't believe that it is good for the Black community, as when you read one of the things that they're trying to do on their About Us page is to dismantle the nuclear family, with 67% of Black kids are born to single parent homes. I don't think that's a good thing for us. You know, even Obama spoke about what can happen to kids when they are born to single parent homes. Joe Biden on the Senate floor in 1993 talked about kids being born to single parent homes, where he thought that in 15 years they would be super predators. And instead of building programs, he decided to subsidize states to build more prisons. So, you know, I don't appreciate the Black Lives Matter, because single parent homes, I do not believe benefit the Black community. And I just don't agree with them trying to dismantle the Black family. I think fathers are very important in not just the Black community, but in every community, and men in general. When a community is lacking the leadership of men, I think that community fails.
Okay, I'm not sure now whether to go to Gary or Jacqueline on this, because clearly we're going down the whole race relations road. Maybe Jacqueline, if I can go to you first, what's your response to Shemeka's comments? Do you feel that this whole BLM movement has victimized the Black community in America?
I certainly won't err on the side of speaking for Black Lives Matter. I feel like I'm somewhat familiar with their platform, but I have never heard of this dismantling of the nuclear family. So that's a shock to me. And I would imagine that if something to that effect was said by Black Lives Matter, I don't imagine that that's high in their list of priorities, or perhaps you may misunderstand. But again, I'm not an expert. I only heard Black Lives Matter protesters and speakers speak more to the brutality with regard to the treatment of Black people as compared to the treatment of white people in this country. And I actually have had this conversation with friends in the past. And it's been, you know, when we talked about how, well, one, this would make us feel unsafe in this country, but then again, too, how to address it as an issue with regard to the police. The recurrent thing that came to us was that it's not a matter of poor training of the police on understanding how to de-escalate conflict, because they seem to be quite able to do this with regard to managing white individuals or non-Black individuals or non-Hispanic individuals when there's a conflict that arises there. So as far as I understand Black Lives Matter, their main thrust, certainly this year, has been police brutality. And that, for me, is an important issue, which this president doesn't seem to care that much about, and he certainly hasn't been on board with doing a whole lot that might actually protect Black people. So if there is a concern, at least on my part, about this administration and their management of racism and things of that nature, one, they don't really seem to be all that inclined to acknowledge it. They are working to dismantle, well, actually not working, but have dismantled bias training within the federal government, because their assumption seems to be that there is no racism and we don't really deal with this anyway, so why should people be trained on it? When the reality is that unbiased, unconscious bias is a key factor in a lot that is involved with police brutality, racism in general, advancement of Black and Latino or people of color in the workplace. So ignoring that there is an issue, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't fix the issue in any way. And that seems to be the approach of this administration, which I don't agree with.
Okay, thank you. Gary, it's often been said that the US is more divided now than it has been since the Civil War. Do you think either of these candidates can really bridge that gap between these various groups?
Well, the response is easy in the case of Donald Trump. No. In fact, he is very much a contributing factor to the divisiveness that we now see in the United States today. I wouldn't lay the blame entirely on him. This probably pre-existed his presidency, but without question, he has exacerbated it. One of the interesting things to note about Joe Biden, who of course has a very long history in American politics, having served in the United States Senate for something around 30 years before becoming a vice president in the Obama administration, is he has a very good reputation, very good record for working across the aisle with his Republican counterparts. You've heard talk about the close relationship he had with former US Senator John McCain, who was a pretty strong Republican before, of course, his passing. And he has a pretty good record across the board in terms of dealing with individuals across the aisle. He's not a very divisive person, and all you have to do is listen to not only his campaign speeches now, but if you go back in time to many of the things that he has discussed and talked about. He has tried to be a politician that I think has brought sides together. And of the two, without question, he is much better positioned to do that, including on this particular issue that you were discussing with both Shemeka and Jacqueline, and that is addressing the issue of African Americans in our country and the conditions in which they now find themselves.
And Gary, I hope you don't mind me mentioning, but you did say off camera that you recently gave up your membership of the Republican Party. Can we just ask why that was?
Of course. I tell many of my friends. I had been a Republican for 30 plus years. I generally agreed with their policies and approach to certainly international affairs and national security, in which I personally worked for most of my professional career, and certainly with regard to trade and other matters. With the election and inauguration of Donald Trump, his public behavior, his comments, his clear departure from what had been the foundation principles of the Republican Party, I just found that I could no longer be a member of that party. And so quite frankly, what I tell my friends is I did not leave the Republican Party. The Republican Party has left me. And I know there are many, many Republicans, many conservatives who feel the very same way, who see that the platform and the positions that Mr. Trump is advancing now undermine US interests and the interests of American citizens. Take whatever issue you'd like, and Donald Trump is not serving it well, whether it's climate change, whether it's the matter of race, equality, and justice in this country, whether it's a question of national security and our relationships around the world, whether it's our economic prosperity and future going forward. I don't see in any account that Mr. Trump is serving this country. He certainly has departed from what had been the previous positions of his party, the Republican Party, and it's for that reason that I no longer carry my membership card.
Okay, Atul, if I can come to you, you just recently wrote an article for Fair Observer talking about the US elections. You said that Trump is not the, he's a symptom, not the disease. And I just wonder if you can explain that for us.
Well, three things to go to when we want to examine Donald Trump. One is increase in inequality. Two, decrease in social mobility. And three, the turning away of the tiny elite from the broader masses, especially given the history of the US, which was all about immigrants coming here to make a better life, the great American dream. And so what do I mean by that? I'm very quickly, I know in the interests of time, give you some quick figures. So when we talk about inequality, point one, let's look at income inequality. Now, the 2011 Congressional Budget Office brought about a report, published a report. From 1979 to 2007, income for the top 1% households grew by 275%. For the bottom 20% grew by only 18%. The reality is, when you account for inflation, real wages went down. So here you are, the bottom 20% slipping deeper and deeper into a morass. And mind you, this is before the Great Recession. After the Great Recession came the bailouts. Peter was robbed to pay Paul, despite the fact that Paul had St. Paul's Cathedral and Peter was in the gutter. And both the Occupy Wall Street and Tea Party were railing against this same phenomenon. Both the left and the right didn't really like the fact that you had socialism on the downside, subsidizing the rich, and capitalism on the upside. I'll take all the risks and I'll walk away with my bonuses, even with taxpayer money. And I remember I was at that time in the great Wharton School, a place where Donald Trump went to school as well. And many of my classmates made a case for paying bonuses through taxpayer money, which for me summed up everything that was wrong with the American elite. It had lost a sense of noblesse oblige. Now that's just to do with income. Let's talk about wealth inequality. The bottom 90% of America did better from the 1920s to 1980s. Their share of wealth actually grew to 35%. In 2016, it went back to 23%, which is the same level as the 1920s. Now, 4 years down the line, things have got worse. So income inequality has shot up, wealth inequality has shot up, educational inequality has shot up. I met a few working class people in West Virginia, even some militia members, and they had something interesting to say. They said, look, all the manufacturing jobs have gone to China. All the working class jobs are gone. They've all been exported out for higher returns for Wall Street. And all the top jobs are taken by you Indians. The CEO of Microsoft and Google are Indians. Our kids from West Virginia are never going to get to Harvard or Stanford or MIT or Yale or Princeton or Carnegie Mellon, you name the top universities of this country. Because the kids who will get there are kids who go to select schools in Montgomery County, good school districts where house prices are high, or private schools, or elite kids, or kids who come from elite backgrounds like upper caste Indians or the Chinese who go to good schools. And and this brings me on to the second point, the point about social mobility. Where is social mobility for us? Where is the great American dream for us? And today, to live the great American dream, first you have to survive the terrible American nightmare. Real wages have been flat, but the cost of living has gone high. Cost of housing has gone up, whether it is rent, mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance repairs, upkeep, healthcare costs have gone up, and the cost of education, the cost of university is absolutely downright scandalous. If there's one scandal that comes square face to face again and again to me, whether it's a state school or a private school, is school fees. And when I was teaching at Berkeley, what shocked me was the salary of the football coach, which is American football, the gladiatorial game which people play with helmets, for those of you who are foreigners, and the amount of money they spent on the stadium. They underpaid people who were teaching classes. I got paid a pittance. I would have been better off flipping burgers in McDonald's. Per hour pay was actually lower for me than for the McDonald's person. So the reality is that all of these inequalities come together and they create anger. They create the wrath of the left out, the grapes of wrath in a modern reincarnation. So, that is, inequality, social mobility. And the third thing is the which I've already alluded to, is the abandonment of all sense of noblesse oblige by the elites. If you look at capital gains tax, they are low. If you look at income tax, that's high, which means Warren Buffett's secretary pays a higher rate of tax than Warren Buffett. Companies like Apple and Google and Facebook have intricate structural arrangements wherein a shell company is in Ireland, something else is somewhere else, and they escape paying a lot of taxes. And so what has happened is that bit by bit, people feel that the system is rigged against them. Congressmen are elected every 2 years. Let's take a classic example. I have some friends who are congressmen. Guess what? They're always fundraising. They have no time to either write laws, which are invariably written by lobbyists or almost invariably, or to hold the executive to account, to say, hang on a minute, why did you do X, Y, Z? Why does this project or program cost as much? The cost of running for office has got higher and higher and higher. When I watch a YouTube video, I just cannot escape ads asking for money nonstop. So I believe every system, every democracy goes through this, as old as Athens. At some point, structure's a trophy. At that point, you have to reform. And the American system has come to a point that it needs reform, and the elites need to sacrifice. And if they don't, there'll be one populist or another, from the left or the right, it doesn't matter. It'll be just like Plato's time, where people will offer simple solutions to complex problems. And that is why Donald Trump is just a symptom. He's not the problem.
Shemeka, I'm sure you've got a few views on that. So, I mean, you mentioned that Trump was creating this level playing field. So what do you make of what Atul's just been talking about in terms of this wealth inequality worsening?
Well, I can say honestly that there were so many things that he said. I started jotting down notes at the very end because it got a little lengthy for me to keep up with all the points that he was making. But one of the things that stood out to me was that I don't feel like the system is rigged against me. And, it's funny to me that we talk about America as if it isn't this great country, and I see people lined up to get here, people wanting to be here because this is the country that they feel like they can achieve in. I don't see planes of people leaving out of here to drop into socialist countries which it seems they're trying to make America. People come over here because they feel like this is the place where they can actually achieve and become better. So I've never felt like this system was rigged against me. I guess I just don't have that mentality. I've always felt like this was the land of opportunity. And if there was anything that I wanted to do, all I had to do was put my mind to it and I could achieve those things. So that stood out for me, one of the statements that he just made. So again, it was a really lengthy, and I didn't start making notes until the very end, but that stood out to me as, you know, that people feel like the system is rigged against them. And when it comes to people being able to get an education, I think if you choose to go to college opposed to being an entrepreneur, which I think this is a great nation to actually become entrepreneurs, I don't really think that, you know, anybody's, like, I shouldn't have to pay for someone who wants to go and be a doctor. If I've chosen to be an entrepreneur and make my way in the world that way, I don't really feel like I should have to pay for anyone that's not my child to go and get an education. So I believe that if that's something you want to do, you want to go and spend 8 to 10 years in school, that should be on you. I don't think that should be the responsibility of everyone or those that chose to go a different route.
Okay, that segues nicely to Jacqueline, who clearly is a doctor and has spent a lot of time in education. What's your take on what Atul was mentioning in terms of the very high fees at university, and also Shemeka's points as well? What's your take on all that?
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly that it's outrageous how expensive it is for university. It was outrageous when I went to school. And luckily for me, though, my mother was actually in school herself. And so I was able to get a lot of grants and scholarships to help me get through with as little loan as possible, considering that I went to an Ivy League college. But most people don't get those breaks, if you call it that. And I guess, you know, it's part of what I think is a big issue with this current administration, because they seem to be very absurd, more concerned about me or myself or I, as opposed to what's best for the community at large. That seems to be reflected in the way that they approach the response to COVID. The list would be too long for me to name. But I don't believe that paying your fair share of taxes means that you're paying for people to, well, first of all, there aren't really a lot of scholarships given by the government to pay for medical school. There just aren't many. So there aren't many people who are getting scholarships from the government to go to medical school or graduate schools in general. For the most part, most people have to pay for that out of pocket or get loans on their own. But for university, I agree that in general, the costs are so high that it becomes cost prohibitive for people to afford to go to university without taking out the equivalent of a mortgage. So to come out of college with the equivalent of debt that's similar to a mortgage is outrageous in this day and age. When there are many universities around the world where people, if you're born and raised in that country, you can go to university for free. But I just don't believe that access to education is something that's a selfish type of a thing, that's something that an individual only benefits from, like one individual will benefit from it. In general, when societies are more educated, they tend to do better. And when wealth is more equally distributed between the people in that economy, the people tend to do better and everyone tends to be somewhat happier. And I think that that's what Atul was discussing with regard to paying your fair share, because as we know with this current president, it sounds like he not only didn't pay his fair share, but he barely paid anything at all, which is not contributing at all. And I'm sure for as much as he didn't contribute, he certainly took part in using resources in this country. When you drive your car on the road, there's just so many things our tax money is used for beyond education. And when you pay what you should pay, contribute in your taxes, just like everyone else. And unfortunately, what Atul was mentioning is that there's so many tax shelters for the very, very rich that they don't not only not pay their share, but they barely pay anything at all, which is the problem, because then there becomes fewer resources, let's say, for just the basics of education, which I work with medically underserved pediatric patients who certainly can't afford private school anyway. And as a result, they get substandard public education. If, you know, if I'm not identifying that they have a learning issue, and if I'm not being the advocate for them to make sure that they have an individualized education plan at the school, nothing may happen for them. And those are the children who will get left behind. And that is unfortunately a part of it. And it's not just race. There are certainly poor white people in this country who have the same problem. But everyone should have access to education, particularly since we all pay taxes. And this is all something we should all benefit from in some way, shape, or form. And education for everyone is not something that just benefits the few who get the education. It actually benefits the society as a whole. I just wish that in general, we could approach the use of, let's say, something as simple as tax dollars in a way that is not just about ourselves as individuals, but what works for the community as a whole.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions in, so I'm just going to go to those and then maybe we'll try and wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so. One from Tara Whitaker, who's well, targeting, I think, Gary with this question. How would the two candidates differ in how they deal with China and also with Iran? So taking it now to a sort of more international perspective.
Be happy to try to tackle those very quickly in the few moments we have left. With respect to China, I will give credit to Mr. Trump for calling to attention and elevating the problem of China's predatory trade practices, which has harmed the U.S. economy as well as many other economies around the world. His response to it, however, has been, in my view, abysmal. This is an issue with which we shared with many, many countries around the world, including most of our own major trading allies, including in Europe and in Asia. And I felt that we could have leveraged our relationships with all of those countries in order to exact the kind of changes we want to see in Chinese trade behavior. Mr. Trump hasn't done that. He tried to negotiate a one-off agreement akin to what was probably done over 100 years ago. You do this for me, I'll do this for you, which is not how trade agreements are done these days. And I happen to know a little bit about that, having participated and even led trade negotiations in my own career. And so in the end, the United States ended up, frankly, becoming worse off in our trade relationship with China than we were before, despite the fact that Chinese exports to the America have dropped, but exports from other countries had picked up the slack. I think Mr. Biden has said, in fact, I know he said right off that he will negotiate trade agreements with China that, along with our allies and friends around the world, the EU shares the very same concerns we do with respect to China's predatory trade practices, their pilfering of intellectual property, enforcing technology transfer of companies that do business there. And so he has said, we will work with our allies to negotiate changes in China's trade behavior. With respect to Iran, President Trump, of course, withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran Nuclear Accord, and began levying pretty onerous sanctions on Iran immediately thereafter. Iran is now suffering under the worst sanctions it's ever experienced in the history of the Islamic Republic. As the president said, it's maximum pressure and it has exacted maximum pain, but it has not produced even minimal change in Iran's behavior. They have upped the level of production of nuclear material, that is enriched uranium, in terms of not only quality of the uranium enriched, but in terms of the quantity. And they have also become even more active in terms of their involvement in other countries in the region in this nefarious activity, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon. So we're not seeing any change in the Iranian behavior despite the economic sanctions they're now experiencing. On the other hand, Mr. Biden has indicated that he wants to look at options for re-entering the JCPOA. My own view, that is, he will not do it as is, that we will try to find a way to re-enter it, though, with changes. Without question, the JCPOA needs some pretty significant changes that mandate changes in Iranian behavior, not only with respect to its production of nuclear weapons, but its behavior in the region, its practices in terms of trying to foment greater instability in some of the countries that I mentioned in the Middle East. But he will not re-enter the JCPOA without any condition. I'm almost confident of that.
Okay, we'll just take a few moments just to perhaps wrap up. So Shemeka, if I can just ask for your closing comments, what would Trump mean, not just for America, but for the world? Just a few, maybe just a few comments, and we'll try and get a couple of sentences from each of you.
Okay, going back to the tax question, I don't think that President Trump broke any laws. I think he paid his taxes according to the laws. And I don't think the tax breaks are just for the elite. I think it's for the well-informed. I know a lot of people that also benefited just because they actually are informed and know how to complete their taxes. So I think that we could all benefit by learning a little bit more. And if there are laws that need to be changed, I think that's where we need to focus. And when it comes to President Trump versus President Biden, when it comes to how America is seen in the world, I prefer a leader that's not going to have us being any other country's bitch. And I believe that when it comes to cracking down and making sure we get the respect as Americans that we deserve, and we're treated fairly and we're treated the way we're supposed to, I believe that President Trump is the man for the job.
Okay, excellent. Atul, just one or two sentences. Who's the man for the job? What difference does it make?
Well, it's not for me. I'm not an American citizen. That's for voters to decide. What we certainly know is that the world will be different. America will be different. Under Trump, we will have less regulation. We'll have more protectionism. And we may see him have a go at tech oligopolies more vigorously than under Joe Biden. Under Joe Biden, we will see more multilateralism. We will see more regulation, presumably, and we'll see that the tech oligopolies have more relaxed for years. I think at heart of the matter is the question whether the post-war order works for America. It doesn't matter if it works for the rest of the world. The question is whether the average American voter, particularly in Pennsylvania or Ohio or Michigan or Florida or Wisconsin, all of the swing states, believes that the post-war order can still deliver. And if the voter believes, or the majority of voters believe it can deliver, you will see a Biden presidency. If the working class voter, if the average American decides that he or she needs to take a wrecking ball to the system, and the system has failed, and the emperor is truly naked, then we will see them vote for Donald Trump to demolish what exists, and we'll have a new order which will be different to the post-war order. We don't know what contours it will entail. We don't know whether that involves war with China, or we already have some sort of an economic war. If it involves conflict with Iran, we don't know if it involves a more abrasive approach towards the world, a quid pro quo approach. But we certainly know that the status quo will be fundamentally altered.
It's so hard to end this because I clearly now want to go back to Shemeka, but we're going to have to draw it to a close at some point. So let's just say thank you so much to all of our panelists and to our viewers for your engagement. And there is definitely far more on this. If you go to Fair Observer, we've got a series called the 360 series, in which you can read a plurality of views about the US elections. And we'd really invite you to add your voices as well. So please do get in touch. You can subscribe, you can sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media, and you can add your voice by writing an article for us as well. So please do join us and become a Fair Observer. Thank you very much to you all.